Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Tina Grotzer. She is a principal research scientist and faculty member at Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she is also a senior researcher at Project Zero. She's an expert in the learning and cognitive sciences with 3 decades of work applying research to real learning environments. She teaches about sustainability, complexity, climate change, cognition, and adaptive expertise. As faculty director of the Next Level Lab, funded by Accenture Corporate Citizenship, she leads research on the future of learning and work in a rapidly changing world. Her earlier work through the Cognition in a Complex World Lab and the EcoLearn team focused on casual learning, climate understanding, and in immersive virtual environments. She has received major awards from the National Science Foundation and from the US government. How are you doing today?
I'm great and happy to be talking with you.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I mean, I feel like talking about learning itself always seems to be this like meta level of talking about just what it means to be human, which I always find to be so interesting that our brain is capable of talking about itself in such an interesting way. You ever just like think about that sometimes where you're like, how can my brain actually figure out how it learns?
Yeah. And so much of what we think about does allow us to know how our brain actually learns. Not all of it, but quite a lot of it. And we form a lot of ideas about how our brains, our minds work. Um, it's the gift of metacognition. Meta on top of our cognition, reflection on cognition.
Yeah. I mean, I've always find it really fascinating to learn about different people's origin stories and what kind of created that spark to be like, this is something I'm really fascinated to look into. What was kind of that moment for you? When did it come in your life?
Yeah. Um, I think it was the confluence of a number of things. I always did well in school, but I never really felt like I was learning very much in school. I learned so much out of school and was always creating and making things and really studying the environment around me. It is why I became so interested in how we learn about the nature of causality and did all of that research on causal thinking. Um, I think that bringing those things together and realizing what can happen when we understand how our minds work and how all of us can learn to think smarter and behave in ways that are more effective based on that thinking, it made me realize how important it was to study it, to understand our minds well, and to help others learn to understand their minds well. It levels well, I guess I don't want to say it levels the playing field. It enhances everyone's performance. It brings everyone up to a higher level of ability, you know.
Hmm. I find that the conversations around education to be so fascinating for this very reason because you can approach it in so many different like lenses where you could approach it pedagogically, but you could this is a really important kind of way to even understand what does learning mean, how do we approach it, how does it actually play out neurologically. And so I guess maybe we could start with the big question
Yeah.
and ask, what is learning? Like what does it mean when we say we are learning something?
Yeah. I mean, I think it means that we are gaining affordances in our abilities, capacities that allow us to do more in terms of our understanding of our environment and what's around us in the future. Bransford and Schwartz are researchers who did work on what's called preparation for future learning. So, all learning is really preparation for future learning. We take information that we learn, we take skills, etc., and we use that information forward to be better adapted to, but also better able to work within our environments, our social environments, our cognitive environments, etc., all of what's around us. Um, you might know that I teach a course called Becoming an Expert Learner. And I decided to teach this course a couple of years ago because I felt like students were coming into the university and they were focused on everybody else's learning, but they hadn't had an opportunity to really think deeply about their own learning. And because we are learning all the time, and we're reflecting on that, we're being metacognitive about our learning, we're saying, oh, I learned that, how did I learn that, what did I do, um, we develop a lot of ideas about what works or doesn't work for us. We sometimes develop ideas about what we can and can't do, without realizing that, with the right effort, it's possible that we just can't do it yet. um,
Mm,
but I wanted to create a course where people were really focused on their own learning, looking at the research, everything we know about minds for, big topics like how do we attend and perceive information? What gets through our attentional gates? How does memory work? What is flow? What is the nature of flow? And what does it mean to be in flow? What is metacognition? All these big important topics, that tell us a lot about learning, but they're about how our minds work. And if we look at the research, all this research on how minds work, what we see are sort of the neurotypical things, the things that happen for many of us, and then also the atypicalities, the things that are different, and that it's important for different learners to know their minds and how their minds work,
mhm,
So I don't think I've ever had a student in this class who, on some level, didn't think about what does this mean for me as an educator, but they are so pleased to be able to be focusing on themselves and their own learning. And, I literally send them out, I'm like, okay, go back about your life for the next week and reflect on how these ideas show up and how you might use them forward. What kinds of moves might you generate now that these things about your mind and how it's working?
mm,
And it helps to dispel certain kinds of misconceptions that they have about their minds, but it also helps them to see things they didn't realize that they could do a little differently and come out with a better outcome for their own learning. So
mm.
it's only a 6-week course, and it's been a lot of fun to teach with, and to be involved in. I learn something new every time I teach it with every group.
Do you feel like there is a particular age group where learning about this can be effective? I mean, I would imagine it would be so amazing to even think this way at 12 years old or 10 years old.
Yeah, I agree with you. I totally agree with you. I have worked with some schools that are really interested in helping students think about themselves as learners in this way. And I think it's very empowering. Um, it also makes school challenging because so often school doesn't fit the ways that we think and learn, right? So, sometimes they schools get pushback and it becomes sort of a revision of how they think about what learning means in that organization, that institution. But I do think
Mm,
that learning it earlier is important, and you can start to learn about these things from the earliest ages, how to be agentive, how to solve problems, how to find puzzles and persevere with them. And you see the youngest children doing that, but around 8, 9, 10, maybe even more, 10, 11, you know, young people are beginning to have a sense of their inner world and their moods and their minds and how their minds work, and a sense of identity that goes far beyond physical characteristics that they might, speak about when they're younger. Um, so it's really a great time to dive in and learn some of these things. And I think that these lessons can, when we really understand ourselves, I think it can change lifetimes. It can change the course
mm.
of someone's life journey.
So maybe let me share what my kind of understanding of learning is, and I'm curious to hear
Yeah.
whether that tracks or
Yeah.
how far I am in just my understanding. So for me, I have the way I visualize it is I have a library in my head, and I have a
Mhm.
library for how to handle myself in these environments, how to, when I
Mhm.
have a problem with my car, what to do. When I, I have all these books in my
Mhm.
head of things
Mhm.
that I've picked up. When I experience something in the world now, I go to the book that I need, I figure out what it is that I do. And if that plays along with what's happening in the world again, I write it in a little darker pencil mark. And I'm like, okay, this is true. This is exactly how this stuff works.
Yeah.
But if I'm a little bit more open minded in that day, or that the event is so different from what's in my book, then I'm forced to try to erase a little bit. And depending on how hard it is, the harder it is to erase. And then I try
Yeah.
writing something else, like, okay, no, this is actually how this
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
And then I just keep moving through my life, and each event requires me to take multiple books out to read, to check, and that
Yeah.
to me is what learning looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that analogically, uh, what you are expressing, parts of it make a lot of sense and fit really well, and parts of it we're pushing a little away from. So the idea that you're writing something a little darker, in pencil as you travel that synaptic pathway. Yes, every time you travel down a certain synaptic pathway in your mind, it reinforces those pathways and it makes them more robust. And unlearning those pathways and thinking more broadly, it can be hard because we automatically, if we're not stepping back to reflect, we automatically follow these well-traveled default pathways. And that can make it hard. It involves unlearning to start to create another pathway that goes in a different direction, or that takes you to a different place. It's one of the reasons why some of the research on trauma is so interesting, because when people dwell on past trauma, they reinforce those synaptic pathways and it keeps taking them to the same place. So unlearning and getting to a different pathway is really important. um, the other part about the analogy about sort of the library in your mind um, is, it's what we, for so long, people had sort of a storage sense of, we store all of this information, kind of a filing cabinet of information. But yet we know that memory is reconstructive, that we reconstruct concepts each time we visit them. We might change them a little bit or bring new information in. So the books in your on your shelves in your library are shifting and changing, and you can't necessarily easily pick up old dusty ones and blow off the dust and use them. Sometimes they degrade, so you may lose some of that information. So I think when we think about learning, one of the things that people often talk about is whether it's, sort of this acquisition of knowledge, or is it something else? And if we think about where we are today in a society where AI is just taking off, and we're in an information age, there's so much to know, there's so much, it's kind of been a knowledge economy. But now, where are we now if we have storage for information that's just data? And that's always changing, because we learn more, we trade up for better explanations of things, etc. It kind of brings us to the question as, what does it mean to learn meaningfully in the world today? And I would say it is about knowing things about how your mind works, having strategies and techniques that you can rely on. um, and some of it's small things, knowing that if you're trying to create a robust memory of something, it's better to try to recall it and to try to travel that pathway and then look back at what you don't remember, rather than just, cross your eyes, pass your eyes over it again in a book or whatever. Um, so anyway, I guess there are parts of what you're saying about learning that make a lot of sense to me, and parts that I think are changing and will be changing even more, in terms of that analogy in the future.
Hmm. I mean, how to learn meaningfully, I think, is such a That's another level of, I think, the education conversation where I think now you have to start questioning why do we learn and what does
Yeah,
it mean to learn well, which is
yeah,
separate from how we learn. And I
yeah,
think,
yeah,
one thing that I'm really curious about and I wanted to touch on before moving forward is this unlearning piece. And so, how much of your work or research has kind of looked at unlearning, and how similar is that process to the learning process?
yeah, yeah. So, I personally haven't done the neuroscience research on unlearning. I have done work on expanding our conceptions of causality, where we often default, at least in Western culture, to simple linear notions of causality rather than relational notions that are about balance or imbalance or cyclic kinds of patterns of causality, escalating. And all the various features that go along with it, time delays, spatial gaps. Um, but, what we see is that unlearning can be really hard because some of the neuroscience research suggests that we don't take in discrepant information. That discrepant information, we bracket it and we set it aside. And for that reason, we're a little Teflon like, we're a little resistant to new information coming in that would help us to establish alternative default pathways. We stay kind of in stasis. The other thing is that often when we're looking at new ideas, the ideas that would help us get to the next level in terms of understanding various concepts, they're not necessarily the things that we see over and over again. What do I mean by that? Um, so AI uses covariation patterns to detect, probabilistically detect what might come next in a sequence. Our brains also use covariation patterns to a large extent. We're considered to be causal Bayesians. We do some other things that AI doesn't do. And then we do a lot of other things that aren't really captured well in some of the CBN or causal Bayes-nets research. Um, However, there are lots of instances in understanding the world where 85% of the time, 90% of the time, the idea that you are currently holding works. It's enough. And so, from a covariation perspective, those couple of times where it doesn't work, they're not enough to drive you to unlearn what you've already understood and try to learn a more complex version of it. And this is one of the places where I think instruction is really important. There are these critical distinctions that get you to push further. Let me give you some examples. So we have an activity that we do with middle school students on sinking and floating. And a lot of times kids think that whether something sinks or floats depends just on the object in the liquid, right? It's also why we use multiple liquids sometimes. And but they will, so we'll put some objects into some beakers, maybe a small piece of candle and a big piece of candle. And they'll predict that the big piece will sink and the little piece will float, and that we'll do that and they'll watch, and aha, it does happen. Then we switch which candle we have in which beaker, and then the big one is floating and the little one it sinks, and they're like, well, wait a minute, what just happened here? And we'll explain that, they'll say, you must have done something to the water. And sure, they're different fluids because we want them to transition from this simple linear idea to a relational idea of what sinking and floating is. It's a relationship between the densities, right? However, there are a lot of cases in the everyday world where the model they had before is perfectly fine and it works. And so unless somebody shows them the couple of cases where it doesn't, they might not trade up for a more complex model. Um,
Mm.
we call that critical exceptions or critical distinctions. And if nobody points out those critical exceptions or critical distinctions, you're not necessarily going to change the model you hold. I think that's true for all of science too. And it's why I don't think AI would ever take the place of the wonderful human mind in terms of driving model revision in science, you know.
A quick question,
Mhm.
because I think this concept of a complex model is really interesting. What do you feel like is the essence of a complex model that makes it more complex than just any other model?
Yeah, yeah. Um, I'm actually glad you're asking this question because I think that it frames some of what's problematic about school. And that is that we often try to go for the big prototypical generalizable concepts that we see, and that's fine and that's good and that's often very efficient and important, and but teachers do that for kids and they never let them see the complexity below it. So what do I mean by the complexity? So as soon as you go, down a level and you stop trying to be efficient, you start to notice all the nuanced information that is highly influential for the outcomes, right? So, we might think that something is a simple linear pattern. This makes that happen. But, you know, it snows, the kids have to go home early from school. Uh, okay. But then there's a domino like effect, right? Of all the other things that happen because of that. It's not as simple as this, then that. Or, we sometimes chop circles in half. So we'll take, part of a system and only look at part of it. Well, you can't really get to deep understanding unless you're willing to entertain that nuance and you're willing to go a level deeper. So when we only give kids sort of the high level abstractions of things, um, we're really doing them a disservice. We're not letting them play around in the details and abstract some of the relationships themselves. And we're also not helping them to see the complex relationships that might really be in play. I'll
Yeah.
give you one more example from climate change. So, kids often think that the problem is greenhouse gases. So, if we get rid of the greenhouse gases, then you know, we won't have global warming. Well, it's not as simple as that. In order to have a habitable planet that we live on and we're comfortable on, we need a certain amount of insulation from outer space to be able to keep us warm enough. We also need breathable oxygen and some other things, but we need to be warm enough. So it's not that we want to get rid of all the greenhouse gases. We need the right balance to make our planet warm enough that we can support life and we can grow crops and do all the things that we do here, and not so hot that we overheat and we create, changes in weather patterns, etc. So it's a balance, it's a relational concept instead of simply greenhouse gases are bad and we need to get rid of them.
Yeah, I
you
mean,
know
I think this particular thing appears in so many places, especially when thinking about ethics, or
yeah,
in a lot of places where it's
yeah.
in our
Mm-hmm.
films.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's super prevalent in Hollywood films where it's just like so simple as here's the bad guy, here's the good guy, and
Yes.
it is a clash
Yeah.
versus good versus evil, and it's often
Yeah.
in the world it just doesn't exist like that. I feel like in a lot of ways for me my mind was open to the complexity when I took my first math class, and then
Mm-hmm.
in college, and then I studied math, and then when I took philosophy, and then now through this podcast, I feel like what started as kind of this naive question about education, what makes a good education, ended up becoming this massive exploration, and it is only like made the complexity infinite, in whatever, it's just so much more because you now see the pieces that you have to talk to neuroscientists, to economists, to I mean, to policymakers, to politicians, to actual students, to parents. It's such a complex thing. I think about this with transportation, with the plumbing system, with sewage. I mean, everything. Nothing is as simple as it might seem on the
Right.
top. And so
That's right.
I guess what I'm curious about is when we think about what a complex model is so there's the you used a word earlier, I wrote it down, procedurally, right? So when you
Mm-hmm.
experience something like driving a car for first time, You learn about it procedurally. This is how I move the car, because that's the first step to even entering the system to then understand it. So then you learn how to navigate to flush. I like do this, and this is when I flush, and you've now
Yeah.
learned it
Yeah.
procedurally. Then there's a. I'm just curious if you could maybe process out what the different levels are, because you said there's a I feel like there's so many levels of complexity that it's not just like you've entered it and now it's complex. There's so many.
Yeah.
What would maybe if you could
Yeah.
generalize those steps?
Yeah, yeah. Well, in terms of learning, so there's all different forms of causality, when you start to look at the patterns of causality and the features of causality. But I think generally in terms of learning, procedural knowledge is your how-to knowledge. This is how I do something. And then there's the conceptual knowledge under it that supports it. This is why I do it that way because this is how that system works. But what often happens is we stop at a surface level with the conceptual knowledge. So, in the instructional design course that I teach, we really push towards what we call the structural knowledge, which is inherent to the conceptual knowledge, but it's the deep structures of how things work and the assumptions beneath those conceptual models. So I talk about it as getting to the bones. So, for example, you can't really understand sinking and floating if you just have this simple linear model. And yet, if you look at many of the curriculum materials for young kids, 7 years old, 8 years old, it's all about making a list of sinkers and floaters. It reinforces that simple linear model.
Mm.
So if you don't get to the bones of what it means for something to sink or float, in terms of relational densities, how do you think about that lava lamp? Why are you washing out that olive oil bottle and then tipping it upside down, all the oil staying in the top of the underneath of the bottle, the bottom of the bottle? So there are all these places where you have to get to the bones of what those concepts are, or you're going to teach surface level conceptions that don't actually empower learners at all. And it's not that young kids can't learn this. We have a series of videos online illustrating the different types of causal patterns. And, I put my twins on a seesaw and they balanced each other perfectly. And then their big sister came running over and one went up, and then their older brother came over and she went up. And it's the outcome depends upon that sense of balance. And kids can have those conversations. They often get stuck in those understandings in school. So we did a set of studies with kids from kindergarten to sixth grade. And what we saw is that the kindergartners and the second graders really had pretty sophisticated notions of some of these causal patterns and could give us lots of examples from their everyday lives. And then by sixth grade, they said no. They couldn't. There were things that really got in the way for them. For covariation and probabilistic causality, the idea that you don't always have a one-to-one correspondence between a cause and an effect. Sometimes the outcome might happen and sometimes it might not. Um, the second graders could give us examples of, I, did this and I did this and I did this, and then my mom got really mad at me, but it took 3 times or whatever. The sixth graders would tell us, nope, it has to happen reliably every time or it's not the cause, because that's, you have to have reliability between causes and effects. So they didn't understand it statistically. Whereas the younger kids could talk about examples that were statistical and did have that complexity. So, I think unfortunately, in our effort to educate, sometimes we prune away some of that rich complexity that kids can talk about and can handle, you know?
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I think there's another layer because this particular chain had started talking about. I think there's a lot of events because the complexity of humans is also perception, where
Mm-hmm.
like
Mm-hmm.
if you believe something, it's
Mm-hmm.
fascinating how the way you perceive something will also be tainted by your prior belief. So it's
Yeah.
not, you're not ever really interacting with some sort of true, at least in my opinion, it's with some true world out there. It's
Yeah.
already, by the time it even enters your senses, I feel like it's already shaped by what you believe. I feel like there's a reason why people who believe in God see God. It's
Yeah.
not like, and people who don't, you know, and
Yeah.
it's there
Yeah.
seems, but then that seems to be something that's so interesting because how do you ever know that what you're experiencing is true then?
Yeah, yeah. Well, well, now we're getting really deep to
Yeah,
what's
no.
true, right? So, when I talk about getting to the structural bones, I mean of the scientifically accepted explanations. Are those true? They're currently our most powerful explanations within the discipline of science. But the research on attention and perception underscores what you're talking about. What it says is that there are all sorts of factors, variables that go into what gets through our attentional gates, and relevance to our own lives, how salient it is. Loudness. Some things matter, like loudness and size. But even those can be missed at times when we're cognitively busy. Most people know the visual perception videos done by Daniel Simons and colleagues, where you're counting the number of times a team is throwing a basketball back and forth, and you're told to count the number of times the people wearing white shirts pass it back and forth. So you tune out the other information. So when a man in a gorilla suit walks into the middle, and beats his chest and then walks off, a lot of people don't see it because they were cognitively busy.
Whoa.
So that's, one variable, but there are also things about relevance. The things we care about, we see immediately. Um, Kevin Dunbar and Laura Ann Petito did some nice research in neuroscience showing that those parts of our brain, that should take in discrepant information, information that doesn't fit with our beliefs, doesn't even fire. When we have prior beliefs that we are um, focused on, and that motivate us. So that is the neurological support for what we commonly talk about as confirmation bias.
Hmm.
It's confirmation bias influences every single one of us every day. So it's
Uh,
really important to be humble about the information that we think we're
that,
taking in.
yeah, I mean, this is so fascinating. I feel like I could talk to you for weeks on end because you have, I mean, just so much. It's very clear that you have cared about this for a long time, and in that
I have.
process, I've learned quite a lot. And I guess here's maybe a question I personally have, which is why do you think all of this, I guess, in a more larger sense, matters? Like, why is it important for humans as a whole to maybe move towards truth or a larger understanding of the world? Like, I I say that to say I come from a family that largely for until my dad's generation was always uneducated, but
Mm-hmm.
in the in I guess in the sense that we consider education
Traditional
now,
education, you mean?
but they were able to still, make a livelihood. They were able to still find meaning in the structures and traditions that they had built up for themselves, whether they were built on truth or not.
Yeah,
And they found sense and understanding in that process.
yeah.
So that was always a question that I always had growing up. Like, how much does, like, oh, we have found truth really matter if
Mm-hmm.
you are, I guess, content to some extent with
Yeah,
falsities or made up construction that you've kind of created to find
yeah.
peace in?
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know that I can answer your question about truth. And, kind of funny, I know Harvard's symbol is about veritas and truth, right? But I think that the reason why I'm so interested in how our minds work is that knowing that our minds all have certain biases or ways of seeing things, um, should introduce humility in terms of our sense of our own truth, or thinking that we know the truth.
Mm,
Um, when you say that your family was uneducated, meaning in a traditional sense, what's really interesting, when you look at some of the indigenous populations living on planet Earth, and how they have lived sustainably on Earth, and how they have handed down wisdom in terms of rituals and story, and really important ways of living on this planet and taking good care of it. I have great respect um, for the kinds of wisdom that that brings forward and increasing humility about some of the choices that other populations on the planet have made, including ones I'm associated with. So, but I also think that scientific disciplines hold certain lenses and ways of seeing and knowing that are put in powerful conversation with some of these other ways of knowing. But it really does require that we bring humility to the equation and an understanding that we're all bringing in different information attentionally. We're letting different things through our attentional gates, and when we do that, we do come to different conclusions at times about how things work, and that can be an affordance. It can be a way of bringing diverse ways of knowing to seeing possibilities, innovation, different ways of living, ways of living sustainably on the planet. Um, it can also bring great division if what we focus on is, we have a truth and you don't, and
Yeah.
that's really tough, and so when I think about education and I think about skills that are important to learn, part of the reason for focusing on the affordances of the mind is because um, it invites the opportunity to listen and really hear and try to hear how it might be different from one's own default assumptions and patterns, um,
Mm,
without needing to respond, just holding the message and kind of taking it in and really giving it its due, and thinking about it.
yeah.
Mm,
I, I wonder, when thinking about knowing and learning,
yeah.
are there senses of differentiating between the hard sciences where I feel like to some extent there feels like there is, no matter how complex, there seems to be like an answer at the end? Like maybe, but it seems like with a lot of other things in terms of like what is good or what is right, those seem to be far more open-ended and complex, and there's so many
Yeah.
more, I feel like, levels of interpretation that
Yeah.
a lot of the questions in the hard sciences don't have to necessarily, um,
Yeah.
I feel like learning and interacting in both of those worlds seem different, but
Yeah.
would you say maybe they're similar?
No, I think that they do make different assumptions. I think, however, that a lot of people think science has a right answer, and it's why they become uh, dismayed with science when science changes its mind. So, science is always looking for the best explanation given the evidence we have available at a given point in time, right? And, some historians of science have said that we don't it's not that scientists are objective. They're as subjective as anyone else, although they have rules that help them reach towards objectivity. But it's also that they are subjective about different things, and the rules of science help them to find objectivity out of that subjectivity. Um, I we have a virtual world called Eco Learn. There's different versions of it. One is called Eco XPT, and in it, kids go into this virtual world and they have to figure out something that's happening. And at the end, kids will often say to me, "Well, what's the right answer?" And I'll say to them, you can come up with the best explanation given the best evidence that you can pull from all parts of the world. There isn't a right answer per se. There are answers that are better reasoned, have more support for them, that support the
Mm,
claims you're making, but it's not that it's a right answer. And that's why it's so important that we help kids understand disciplinary knowledge and different ways of knowing, because if they think that science is supposed to have a right answer and it doesn't, they're going to become disillusioned with science rather than see science as always having an open mind in a sense towards other possibilities. So, we thought we would solve all kinds of questions when we understood the genome, right? The human genome. And we did. But we also suddenly epigenetics and other things start to come into play. And so every time we sort of, get to a point where like that's a powerful explanation, we find other levels of explanation that are even more
Mm.
powerful that we strive towards. So when we think about the humanities, or we think about the liberal arts, or not non things that you would say aren't in the scientific domain, um, I think the questions are equally as complex, maybe more, as you're suggesting. And I think that understanding how our knowledge in these fields comes about is really important. So, the conception that, if it's kind of similar to the science, really, the more forms of, so if you want to know what happened, a certain event or scenario plays out historically, and you want to know what happened, the way to get towards objectivity is to get as much subjectivity as you can, collect as many different stories of what happened, and from that will emerge a narrative that will include diverse voices and will give you the better sense of what happened than if you just ask one observer, right? So there are things about the disciplinary knowledge in the humanities that are so important for kids to learn. And that's also about how our minds work. It's because we have confirmation bias. So if something happens on the playground and I want to know what happened, yes, I'll ask the two kids who, are ready to beat each other up, but I'm also going to ask all the other people standing around. I'm going to ask what was happening before, what happened after. You're going to just like this is what happens. The NFL does this when, something happens on the football field. They play the tape too. So, you work really hard to get good information. And I think
Mm.
when we help learners know that that's about how our minds work and how we take in information and how we jump to conclusions, and, you know, um,
Mm.
so the humility is important, and also the understanding the different epistemic lenses.
I mean, I think this humility piece is a really fascinating one, and I'm just curious because I wonder. You spent a lot of time in these higher university, in these
Mhm.
kind of, I guess, I don't know, prestigious spaces. When bringing, I sometimes wonder as universities start to play a larger and larger role, because I think for a long time it was kind of just a space that a few people would go to and a few people would have access to, but most people wouldn't even really know,
Mhm.
or they wouldn't aim for it. But now, as
Right.
it's become more and more central to American culture as a whole,
Mhm.
with more people aiming for them or learning about them, or at least knowing a person of a person of a person who might have been there or something like that, I wonder if there starts to become this larger and larger gap between, it's one thing for me to have a discussion with you and say you don't know what you're talking about, whatever, and then it's
Mhm.
another thing to for me to be like, the way you reason isn't even right, you don't even know how to, the way you're actually trying to learn.
Mhm.
It feels like there becomes this huge divide between then those who have, I guess, the ability to reason in certain ways versus those who like maybe never picked up on those ways of reasoning, right?
Yeah. I think it puts some of the responsibility on those who know how human minds tend to work. So if I
Mm-hmm.
know that confirmation bias is a thing, and I'm having a conversation with a family member who doesn't dwell in any of the spaces that I dwell in, um, I need to be able to think about what are the puzzles, why are we getting,
Mm.
what are the sticking points and why? And sometimes, the things I say need to take a back seat. And I also look for ways that where we have common um, knowledge or bridges so that we can focus on that. Well, if this happened in this way, what might you think then? To try to find that common ground. But I do think that I think you're right about that, the puzzle. And I think, you know, the puzzle of people educated at the university versus not is one level of challenge that we face societally. But I think we also face another level, and that is that with Gen AI becoming such a big thing, um, if people don't know how it works, if they need to know the epistemology of Gen AI. How does it generate
Mm-hmm.
responses? How does it know certain things? No, you used an analogy with me earlier. Gen AI doesn't reason analogically. It can give you an analogy that it has summed across lots of examples in its probabilistic and predictive model, but it can't think like you just did analogically. It isn't metacognitive. We are metacognitive, and it lets us think about our thinking. And that's a powerful way to correct certain directions we're going in, realize affordances, be creative, think about strategies. Gen AI doesn't do any of that. But if people don't know that and it gives the appearance of doing it, they're just as likely to bring misconceptions about the mind of AI as people do to their own minds. Our minds work this way. Well, actually, we realize that they don't, and if we know that they work that way, we'll do these things differently. um, we're going to do that with AI too. And, we
Mm.
won't be able to use it well unless we can really think about what are the affordances it brings, and what are the limitations. And that's changing, of course, all the time. But the basic mechanisms behind it um, truly are they're different. I mean, that they have deep similarities with human minds, and then human minds have affordances far beyond. But and they're normative in a way because they're summing across all of these examples. So, people can be very influenced by AI and what AI says, and if the chat bot says this, or they can't differentiate when they're talking to a human who might be holding something with humility, and a chat bot that's just gonna, sum across a lot of things and tell you what it tells you. Um, so, I think um, there's some real puzzles on the horizon for
Yeah.
the human capacity to have deep conversations and to understand each other.
No, for sure. And
Mm.
I'm just curious in your personal experience, what are some of the spaces you feel like you've experienced the most capacity to hold space for complexity and nuance? And what
Mm.
do you think it is about either the people in those spaces or the spaces that allow for that to exist?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do think it's possible to do it at the university. I think that I guess what I would say generally about the spaces is that they have a deep respect for the processes of learning
Mm,
and where one gets to conversationally as opposed to um, a set of objectives. You're all going to know this by this point in time, and then we're going to move on. um, it's more engaging people in the provocations and the puzzles and the deep questions about the nature of humanity that have come up over and over and over again, and will continue to resonate and come up again, and really have those conversations. I think, and where have I seen that? So I've seen it in some camp and school environments where it's sort of set forth as the important thing to do. There's one school that I work with that uses what's called a living curriculum approach. It's called the Tremont School. It's a small school. And instead of a backward design, I'm the expert. I know all these things about history or science, and these are the things, and you're going to learn them. It asks kids to chart their learning forward. It uses forward design, and in doing that, often there are puzzles and provocations that come up, right? Um, but I've also seen it in, seminars. It does happen in colleges. And sometimes I think it happens really beautifully in religious settings, where people sort of entertain a question, or people from different faiths come together to really talk. Um, I think there have been examples where people have really sort of dug in deeply. Um, so a colleague who had started originally he was involved in the Physicians for Social Responsibility, and then he started the Center for Health and the Human Health and the Global Environment. um, it was originally at the Harvard Medical School. His name is Eric Chivian. He reached out across the aisle to the conservative Christian community, and really looked at, how do we take care of planet Earth together? How do we bring your ways of knowing and my ways of knowing together, because we both care about the planet and really
Mm,
focus on creation care. And I think those
mm,
are, those can be rare instances. I think that people need to be willing to really sit with and hear things that might feel really alien to them in some way.
yeah. I mean, as we start wrapping this conversation up, I mean, one thing that I really want to, really, I feel like has been puzzling for me is I feel like there's not a predisposition, but when some people face complexity or see that a
Mhm.
problem is really
Yep.
complex, they get excited and they're
Yeah.
like, wow, this is so
Yep.
beautiful. I feel this sense of wonder and awe. And
Yeah.
I think there's other people when they deal with complexity, it's actually really overwhelming and it's
Yes.
scary. It's like
Hmm.
I actually don't know anymore. I used to think I
Right.
knew, now I don't know, and I'm really
Yeah.
scared.
Yeah.
But I think when you're confronting people who have more of that fearful disposition, breaking that kind of simple notion of how things are can actually be a lot more catastrophic than not.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so I, that means you have to develop a sense of courage before you get lost in the
Mm.
uncertainty of things to be like, I can
Yeah.
handle even if I
Yeah.
don't know. How
Yeah.
does that process happen? Because that
Yeah.
seems separate before you're like, oh, well, you don't know much about the world here. Like, and then you're
Yeah.
like, kind
Yeah.
of, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're right that there's a huge emotional um, context here, and that, people often live by a simpler version of the world because they can hold on to a sense of control, and that they know it and they understand it. And that makes so much sense. And increasingly, as we live in what people refer to as a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, it takes a lot of bravery. Um, and it takes a sense of, in my lab, we talk about something called regenerative hope that you keep, finding the things that allow you to be hopeful. I think teachers have a lot of this, and they let you keep reinvesting and reinvesting. And I think complexity is like that. um, you can start in one place and you keep sort of investing new hope and getting a little further and a little further, but you have to be willing to be in it for the long haul. And so it does require, I think, communities that are together
Mm,
and are together for long periods of time. Um, I think that this is a really important role that classrooms can play, but I think most schools don't. I think most schools focus on, here's the list of things, knowledge that, right now you can get anywhere out on the internet, and efficiency. And I've covered it, rather than going for deep understanding, rather than going for these deeper social skills, social emotional skills, really, of knowing each other and being able to talk across differences. Um, all of that's incredibly, incredibly important. And it doesn't just happen if you don't have opportunity. And you do see, you see young people who are maybe disillusioned with, at the age where they're supposed to be separating from their parents and moving off into the world. That's when they often go out and find such communities, because they're kind of pushing against what they've been embedded in, and they're looking for new opportunities and new possibilities, and they start to experience other ways of thinking about the world and being. I think it's part of what makes some of the independent schools that have a little more control over curriculum rich places of learning. I think, and unfortunately not necessarily available to everyone. And I think it's why college can sometimes be that chance for people, because they're ready, they're open to exploring different ways of thinking and knowing at that age often, as they're
Mm.
rejecting what didn't work for their parents, you know. So,
Yeah. I mean, if there's one kind of simple place that you think somebody could start, let's say they're like, I want to start
mm,
facing the world a little bit more
yeah.
courageously and heading into the complex to know what exists behind the veil that I think there is. What would you maybe recommend, or what
Mm.
would you, yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think that there are programs out there. There are programs that use like the seminar approach with big, you know, big, almost essential long-term questions. Um, there
Mm.
are, one of the oldest charter schools in Massachusetts, Parker Charter at Devon's, Mass. They use big essential questions across the entire school year, and those might be things like, um, what is the nature of truth? Are the world's religions more alike or different? Actually, that one I'll
Mm.
attribute to a teacher at Tremont School who also, but there's a version similar at Parker Charter. What does it mean to be fair? Um, why do people fight? Why do they, so really big questions that all the grades entertain in some way. And they really learn the conversational skills to think deeply about these concepts, deeply and well. Um,
Wow. That
yeah,
is so cool.
yeah,
I've
yeah,
I've always been fascinated by pieces of art or like books that are compilations of some sort. And so like
yeah,
I feel like even as you were sharing that, I feel like philosophy in a lot of ways for me opened up that door of just like these are the questions, which for most of my life I didn't even know
yeah,
that those questions one existed,
yeah,
or that you could ask them out loud and not be kind of
yeah,
berated for asking useless questions, you know,
yeah,
and really
yeah,
allowing any questions to exist.
yeah,
And I feel like even having together an artistic piece of some sort that kind of for each field kind of put together some of these like essential questions, and
yeah.
like just so you can know it exists. You don't need to know the answer for them, and
No,
but
no,
just to know that you're
no,
allowed to ask them and that they
yeah,
are out there and other people have done a
yeah,
lot of the thinking about them.
yeah,
It must feel at least like an opening. But
yeah. Yeah, well, and one of the things Parker Charter has a really nice there's a nice video online of a teacher engaging a class in what's actually, really a false dichotomy, perhaps. I don't have an answer, I don't know, but it's, what's more important, happiness or freedom? And she has her students explore through the eyes of, the lens of different philosophers. And the students will say, I don't have to memorize, the year that Sartre said this. I instead am really focused on what was said and how does it apply to this thing that's happening today. And so often those big essential questions, they play over and over again. So I have the students in my instructional design class focus on the Salem witch trials and look at what happened there. And it's such an interesting experience because, you can relate it to McCarthyism later. You can think about what does it mean for something to be a fake news or a false narrative in language from today. So lessons that people were grappling with back then, things that um, you know, we think that we know more than people in the past. That's, what Sam Weinberg, the historian, talks about as presentism. We also use something called 2020 hindsight, and we're like, oh, it was predictable, when no, indeed it was not, right? So, but you look at these big questions, and you can look at them in history class if what you have to teach about is the Salem witch trials. But what does that mean for today? And the narratives that people are saying are fake or true, or what does it mean for the nature of what we believe, and how we can get caught up in things, and so much to be learned.
I mean, the world becomes so fascinating when you open
Yeah,
up each one of these doors, and then all of a sudden biology is no longer separate from physics, which is no longer separate from poetry, which is no
that's
longer
right.
separate from mathematics, you know, and it's actually
Right.
this giant, beautiful landscape
Yeah.
of information and knowledge and perception. And it's just, I don't know,
Hmm.
but it's like, yeah, we, there is a schooling system that's so devoid from creating a connection to that, and that I think is sometimes terrible. But I mean, it's lovely having conversations like this, and it's super cool to also know that the work is being done. And I'm so grateful to have been able to speak to you today. Thanks for getting on the show.
Oh, I appreciate the opportunity, Gotham. Your questions are great. And I love that you are on this endeavor to truly rethink education and kind of see where we could be going.
Yeah. But yeah, I want to say thank you. And I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this show and this conversation. As per usual, stay re educated.